All right, thanking God once again for the way that he brings clarity, this time through something that might seem counterintuitive to producing clarity, and that is polarization. Understanding that we have seen, I think, in each of the Gospels leading up to John, the way in which Jesus' presence is just as he said. He came not to bring peace, but a sword, drawing divisions in Israel. And chapter 7 here in John seems to give us just that kind of illustration of that part of his ministry, as chapter 7 is going to basically show that there is literally in verse 43 a division among the people over him. And as I have been mentioning from time to time, I am, at least as I estimated, I'm super behind right now, and so I'm using that once again as an excuse to just give us generalized summaries as I want to look at this chapter thematically, as I've done, I guess, in a few other chapters. Either way, chapter 7 is going to show us, according to the ESV's organization that I'm rocking with right now, in verses 1 through, what is it, 24, it is going to show that he is going to go up to the Feast of Booths, even though his brothers don't necessarily believe he is who he says he is, that being the Christ. They're going to challenge him to do the same things in the big city that he has done in the small town Galilee. And of course, as we mentioned recently on Sunday, he is going to accept that challenge, even though he is not going to let them know that he is planning to accept that challenge. Verses 25 on through 31 are then going to show the manifestations of the division that his presence at the quote unquote Feast of Booths, even though it never literally says he goes up to the feast, he's doing most of his work at the temple, even though he is there during the feast. Either way, his presence, wherever he is in Jerusalem at that time, is going to provide a division in the crowd that we will begin to see in that first section, those first 24 verses, but it's going to continue to widen that separation in verses 25 through 31 as they are going to ponder the question, can this be the Christ? Leading to him giving an illustration that they are not going to completely understand in verses 37 through 39, talking about not only his presence, but something he is going to promise later on when he is encouraging his apostles that his departure is going to lead to the arrival of the Holy Spirit. A metaphor for the Spirit he is going to use here is rivers of living water flowing out of those who are actually accepting the truth of what Christ is giving them, leading to the final section, verses 40 through 52, where, as we mentioned, it's going to specifically say in verse 43 that a division rose among the people, leading to that theme that I guess we want to look at the chapter through, that being polarization, understanding that that verse goes all the way back to the beginning of the chapter, showing that the polarization reached even into his own family, understanding that back in chapter 2, his mom had enough confidence in him to say, in terms of turning the water to wine, she told the servants at the feast where they were lacking wine, do whatever he tells you. She thought, even if that didn't mean he was the Messiah, which she probably thought he was, since she had the visit from the angels, as we've seen in the previous versions, she not only had confidence that he was potentially going to be something. By the time they got to the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee, she'd already seen some things in him that led her to believe that which his brothers refused to believe. And understanding that, there was a polarization that seemed to reach, as we said, even within his family. Understanding that their doubt led to the challenge that they extended to him to go up to the big city, Jerusalem, to do what you had done here in the quote unquote small pond. Don't just be, as we would call it, a big fish in a small pond. Show us what you got. They go up to the feast. He goes later, low key. And that is going to, as we mentioned, show that the separation that he is provoking in Israel goes beyond his family too. In verse 11, where it's going to say, the Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, where is he? And there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said he is a good man, others said, no, he is leading the people astray. It's not going to be the last time, because as we said, the gap, I guess, in perception about him is going to widen even more in the next section, verses 25 through 31, where specifically in verse 30, it's going to say, so they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not come yet. Yet many of the people believed in him, understanding that there is now a growing division between those among the authorities who were looking to arrest him, and then kind of just the grassroots population in Israel who more and more is beginning to, or seeming to begin to, believe that he is who he claims to be, leading up to what we noticed in that last section regarding the population or the polarization within the population. It's literally going to say in verse 43, once again, so there was a division among the people over him. Understanding that one of the things I neglected to mention in verses 32 through 36 was the way in which, if I didn't already say it, the polarization was leading the authorities not only to want to kill him, but they were taking steps toward that end, as that section shows that they were trying to take him into custody. And there was polarization even amongst the authorities, understanding that the officers they sent to arrest him are like, nobody ever spoke like this when they were challenged. Why did you come back with them? They're like, we haven't heard anything like this before. You go get them yourself. My ad lib. They didn't say that, but that was the excuse that they gave. They were even stunned by the words that he spoke, so much so that they did not follow through on their assignment to arrest him at that time. But there was not just a polarization amongst the people. There was a polarization in the way that it manifested in their sight, in their approach to him. Some seemed to take more of a position of denial. No matter what they saw, it wasn't going to be enough to convince them, something we've seen in previous Gospels that we'll get a chance to see here in verse 21, where it's going to say, the crowd answered, the crowd answered, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Understanding in the previous verse, he said, none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? And that's going to be their response. But ironically enough, there are going to be those who, with a more honest perspective, are going to say in verse 25, some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, is this not the man whom they seek to kill? Understanding that we often emphasize the need to reconcile the distance between our personality and our character. There's part of the crowd that saw clean through the personality of those who were pretending like they weren't trying to kill the Christ, to basically understand that their actions betrayed their words. And so likewise, it is going to show us that there is a distinction or polarization between those who were in denial and those who were actively using their senses of perception to discern whether or not this might be the Christ, as we see in that same section. In verse 25, where they're saying, isn't this the one they seek to kill? They're debating. They're not just blindly following him and saying, this is the Christ. They're considering, based upon the law and the things they've heard about the Christ, whether this could really be him. And as we said, he does not resent being questioned. He resents the motive with which the questions might be lobbed, understanding that he's identified. Some of the questions are designed to create reasons to kill him. Understanding that the hypocrisy that we see representing that portion of the polarization, it's not just polarization between the people, but it's polarization within people. It's showing, as we said, there was too great a distance between the personality and the character of those whose motives were hidden, and their motives were actually, like we said, to kill the Christ. There was actually a separation between his appearance and what he was inwardly, but it was not pretentious, meaning he wasn't projecting anything that would deceive the population. It simply meant that in order to understand who he really was, they were going to have to actually have a conversation to get to the truth of who he was if they were interested. And that is exactly what we're going to see at the end of the chapter, as basically, let's take it in sequence. At the end of the chapter, Nicodemus is once again going to make it clear that he is standing out or distinguishing himself from the rest of the Pharisees by saying, shouldn't we at least question him to find out whether or not the things he's saying are true? They're not interested in that, but they do understand a difference between what he appears to be and what he is actually doing. Round about verse 14, where it's going to say, about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up to the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? Leading him to say, my teaching is not mine in verse 16, but the teaching of him who sent me. Going further, he is literally going to talk about that distinction between appearances and the deeper reality in a person, specifically himself, in verse 24, where he's going to say, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. The very thing that part of the crowd that is being polarized by his presence is unwilling to do. As we said, Nicodemus will show us as they're debating what to do with the Christ toward the end of the chapter, picking it up in verse 50, where it says, Nicodemus, who had gone to him before and who was one of them, said to them, does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does. And they replied, "Are you from Galilee too? Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee." Reminding me of, like we said, the three ways in which Jesus' presence seems to polarize Israel. Once just polarizing the people, showing how it seemed to present a polarization possibly within his own family. Understanding there seemed to be a distinction between the perception of his mother and his brothers regarding who he might actually be. Likewise, that extended into a polarization, just a physical polarization amongst the people lining up in different camps, some believing and others disbelieving. But it also polarized their perspectives, because in order to hold on to their disbelief, there are some who would enter into denial, understanding the things that they were witnessing. Unlike any things that they seemed to have seen before in Israel. How do we know? Because there were others who were willing to discern that these were actually historical events, things that they had never seen before, questioning whether or not, if he's not the Christ, will the Christ be able to, or will the Christ do anything more miraculous than what they were seeing out of Jesus? And then finally, we get a chance to see that there was an internal polarization within the people, understanding that their denial represented that even though outwardly they were seeming to be God's people, inwardly those in denial were still refusing to believe, as opposed to simply having a healthy skepticism. And then finally, there was a healthier division that didn't so much represent that kind of hypocrisy, but there was a healthier division even in the Christ himself, who, even though outwardly he might not have seemed to be one who was capable of doing all the things he was doing, his modest appearance seems to have contained great ability that was not dependent upon their teaching. Understanding that for whatever reason, this chapter at this time reminded me of why Jesus himself might not have picked apostles that came out of their schools. Understanding that in order to fit in their schools, there are quite a few things, truths, that they might have had to suppress simply to fit in. And so much like Christ, not having fit in or been conformed into the image of their institutions, did not have to suppress certain truths in order to matriculate or rise through the ranks of the Pharisees. Likewise, his apostles didn't either. And so he might have found in them the same thing that the Father was instilling in him, and that was an ability that God was giving him and growing in him that was actually unhindered by the mistakes woven in to the conventional wisdom of the times. Reminding me of some of the great mentorship and wisdom that I actually got while I was in preaching school. Understanding that the preaching schools and seminaries are a good thing to the degree we have the opportunity to be blessed as I was with a mentor who guided me in being able to think independently, not independently of the Bible, but independently of the canon of what was being taught, insofar as it freed me to actually have a better understanding of the things that Christ actually said. With that, my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that we take the best of both worlds, that we learn from the true teaching that we're getting in the schools that are trying to guide us into a better understanding of what Christ said. But likewise, we take the best of the wisdom that we can get from those schools. And that is, don't let anything that any of us say stand in the way of you having a better understanding of what Christ is actually calling you to do. Or maybe stated a different way, try not to be such a great fit with your institution, your job, or whatever it is that you're trying to fit into, that you're no longer the right fit with God.